As I continue to talk about each Baseball Hall of Famer in each decade, not only do I get more excited as we get closer and closer to the present day of those in Cooperstown, but I also find it interesting to learn about some of these really obscure guys that I wouldn't have ever known about if not for doing this, and I hope you guys feel the same way about this too. I really do. This sort of thing is going to continue as I start to talk about the 1950s of Cooperstown inductees. After the baseball writers met in 1950 and failed to elect anybody to the Hall, they met the next year and voted in two new players, which were Mel Ott and Jimmie Foxx, both of which were two of the game's biggest stars during the 1930s and 40s. Mel Ott may have only been 5'9", 170 pounds when he played, but he had one of the biggest careers of anybody who played while he was around. In 1951, he received 87.2% of support from the baseball writers, and the right fielder spent his entire 22-year playing career with the New York Giants from 1926 to 47. Ott was signed by the Giants when he was only 16 years old, and, albeit not much, even appeared in games with them before he could legally vote. John McGraw insisted on never sending him to the minor leagues, and it wasn't before long that Mel became a star. A 12-time NL All-Star, he led the NL in homers 6 times, recorded 100 RBI 9 times, and was always so patient at the plate too, leading in walks 6 times and odd base percentage 4 times. He led the Giants to a World Series victory in 1933, hitting .389 with a couple of home runs in the 5-game series. Master Melvin, as he was also known, retired from playing in 1947, and he finished with 511 home runs, 1,860 RBI, a .304 average, and he's also one of 4 players ever with 1,800 runs scored, 1,800 RBI, and 1,700 walks. The other baseball legend to come from this 1951 class was Jimmie Foxx, who was one of the all-time great first basemen. He got 79.2% of votes that year, and for some reason I always thought he was a Red Sox lifer, but obviously he wasn't, as he spent most of his time playing under Connie Mack in Philadelphia. Nicknamed the Beast and Double X, he was initially signed as a catcher before converting to first base and would then lead the A's to back-to-back championships in 1929 and 30. Known as a guy who would hit for both power and average, he was a 3-time AL MVP and 9-time AL All-Star, who led in home runs 4 times, RBI 3 times, averaged twice, and had a lifetime slugging percent of .609. He also took home the AL Triple Crown in 1933 after hitting .356 with 48 homers and 163 RBI. He walked away from the game in 1945 with a lifetime .325 average, along with 534 home runs and 1,922 RBI. Not only was he one of the most dominant right-handed hitters ever, but he was also one of the kindest players of his time, and everyone in the Red Sox dugout was left shocked when he got cut in 1942. Knowing a legend of the game had just got released. 1952 was very similar to the year we just finished going over, with 2 new inductees being elected by the baseball writers, and those 2 were Harry Heilmann and Paul Waner, who were 2 of the best right fielders in baseball when they played. First, I'll start with Harry Heilmann, who spent most of his career being overshadowed by Ty Cobb in Detroit. He spent all but the last 2 years of his time with the Tigers and got 86.8% of votes in 1952. He initially struggled when first arriving in Detroit in 1914, but after spending 1918 in the Navy, he came back and was able to really find his swing the following year. Harry hit .300 in every season from 1919 to 1930, which included 4 AL batting titles and a .403 average in 1923. As great as he was, though, he started to develop arthritis in his wrists, and although he attempted a comeback with Cincinnati in 1932, it didn't go very well, and then he was done for good. His career totals include a .342 average, along with 2,660 hits and 1,543 RBI. His old teammate and manager Ty Cobb once described how good Heilmann was, despite never being the best player on his team, saying, quote, "People nowadays just don't realize how great a hitter Harry was. Next to Rogers Hornsby, he was the best right-handed hitter of them all." I'm really glad to hear that Cobb was able to recognize just how amazing Harry Heilmann was. The other all-time great right fielder from the 1952 class is Paul Waner, who spent a lot of his time in Pittsburgh with his brother Lloyd in the 1930s. He got 83.3% of support from the writers and burst onto the scene immediately in 1926. He hit .336 as a 23-year-old rookie and would win NL MVP the next year after hitting .380 with 131 RBI and leading the Pirates to the World Series that year, where they'd get swept by the Yankees. He'd win 2 more batting titles with the Pirates and would hit .340 during his 15-year-long tenure there. After getting released by them after 1940, he spent the next few seasons with the Dodgers, Braves, and Yankees, all while collecting his 3,000th hit in June 1942 and retiring after 1945. Waner finished with a career .333 batting average and 3,152 hits. He and his brother Lloyd were known as Big Poison and Little Poison, respectively, and Paul spent so many years in Pittsburgh as one of the best to ever do it in right field. This was a unique year for the Baseball Hall, because not only did 2 new inductees get elected by the writers, which were Dizzy Dean and Al Simmons, but this was the first year the Veterans Committee was formally established. This ballot was for players who had been on the BBWAA ballot for a long time but still hadn't gotten in, and a big group of new inductees came from this committee. They were Ed Barrow, Charles Bender, Tommy Connolly, Bill Klem, Bobby Wallace, and Harry Wright, who was the brother of a guy I talked about in my 1930s video, George Wright. When Dizzy Dean played, he was always one of the more popular players in the league and everyone loved to be around him. Dean, whose real name was Jay, got 79.2% of votes in 1953 and spent his shorter 12-year career with the Cardinals and Cubs during the Great Depression. After debuting with St. Louis in 1930, Dean became a full-time starting pitcher with the Cardinals 2 years later, and his time with them was nothing short of spectacular, as it included 4 NL All-Star selections, an NL MVP award in 1934, along with a World Series victory that year. He also led in wins twice and strikeouts 4 times in that span. Injuries started to pile up on him, resulting in a trade to the Cubs in 1938, and he was done after making only 1 start in 1941, save for an appearance with the St. Louis Browns in 1947 as a promo stunt. Anyway, he finished with 150 wins in 12 seasons. Okay, pretty much 10. And a lifetime .302 ERA. One of his most famous quotes was, "If you can do it, it ain't bragging." I think this sums up Dizzy Dean quite nicely as a ball player and as a guy who had one of the more popular personalities in baseball when he played. The other BBWAA electee this year was Al Simmons, a left fielder who played under Connie Mack for a lot of his career. He received 75.4% of votes, so he just barely got into the Hall this year, but he was still one of the best players of his time anyways. He started with Philly in 1924, and during his tenure there, led all hitters with 1,796 hits, and set the record for most hits by a right-handed batter in 1925 with 253, and that still stands today. He also won 2 batting titles there and helped the A's win the World Series in 1929 and 1930. Simmons was then sold to the White Sox in 1933 and started off well there, but would then spend the next decade or so bouncing around a few teams before retiring in 1944. He finished with a .334 average, 2,927 hits, 1,827 RBI, and 307 home runs. It's amazing how he grew up in a really poor family in Milwaukee and would go on to become one of the best players in the game during the 1930s. The first of 6 Veterans Committee inductees in 1953 is Ed Barrow, who was the architect of the New York Yankees during the days of Babe Ruth. His time as an executive started when he was an owner and manager of many small baseball teams in the 1890s, and he'd become the Red Sox manager in 1918. He won the World Series with them that year, and in doing so, made the widely important decision to make Babe Ruth a full-time outfielder as opposed to a two-way player. He did this in order to keep Ruth's bat in the lineup every day. When the Babe was sold to the Yankees in 1920, Barrow followed suit, and he would go on to build a baseball empire for 25 years that resulted in 14 AL pennants and 10 World Series championships. Some of the guys he was able to lure to the Bronx included Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio, Lefty Gomez, Tony Lazzeri, and Red Ruffing, some of the game's all-time greats. Ed was also the one who created jersey numbers, jersey retirements, and was the first to let fans keep foul balls. He was also the driving force behind the building of the iconic Yankee Stadium that was home to so many great baseball players throughout the years. Charles Bender is the next inductee here, and he was yet another pitcher who played under Connie Mack in the early 1900s. As one of the first great Native American players, the A's signed him when he was 19 years old, and then he proceeded to pitch well as a rookie and would help Philadelphia win 3 championships throughout the next 4 seasons. Chief, as he was also known, had an ERA of .232 with the Athletics, and he was let go after, you guessed it, the 1914 World Series. He'd pitch in the Federal League for a year before joining the Phillies for a couple of seasons and then randomly pitching a game with the White Sox 8 years after that. He finished with 212 wins, a .246 ERA, and Connie Mack, who sometimes referred to Bender as Albert, said of him, quote, "If everything depended on one game, I just used Albert, the greatest money pitcher of all time. If Mack never discovered who Bender was when he was a teenager, who knows if any of this would have ever happened." One of the first 2 umpires ever elected to the Hall was Tom Connolly, who umped the first ever American League game in 1901. He was always known for keeping his games well-paced and free of any bad blood, and when anyone crossed the line, he was quick to eject them, even if it was someone as big as Babe Ruth. He once ejected the Babe from a game for screaming at a fan in the stands, and when he was ejected by Connolly, Ruth never got tossed from a game again. He called the first modern-day World Series in 1903, which was the first of 8 Fall Classics he'd officiate, and was behind the plate for 4 no-hitters. Connolly was always one of the calmest and most respected umps back then, and he talked about his methods saying, quote, "A well-groomed, alert umpire adds dignity to a ballgame, and a good official is one who never attracts attention." You know what? I think lots of umps nowadays would really benefit from hearing that. Anyways, the other umpire elected this year is Bill Klem, who exclusively worked in the National League during his career. Nicknamed the Old Arbitrator, he pioneered umpiring in many ways, as he was the first to wear a chest protector when calling balls and strikes, and one of the first to use hand signals for balls, strikes, foul balls, and fair balls. Klem umped from 1905 to 41, with his first 16 years being only as a home plate ump because of how good he was as a ball and strike caller. Similar to Tom Connolly, he was always one of the most respected umps in the early days, but he was never afraid to throw anyone out of a game if needed. Bill was assigned to a record 18 World Series games during his career, and he always maintained his composure and made sure the game was always being played the way it was meant to be. Bobby Wallace is the next inductee here, who is a shortstop who spent a quarter of a century in baseball as a player from 1894 to 1918. He started with the Spiders as a pitcher, then as an outfielder, and eventually found himself at shortstop permanently, where he was one of the best to do it at his position. Wallace was just a good hitter at best, but he is mostly known for being an amazing defensive shortstop. He led in multiple defensive stats in many seasons and is credited with developing the scoop and throw method that makes it easier for infielders to throw the ball. Thanks to his style of play, he was able to play until he was 44 years old, and he finished with 2,309 hits, 1,121 RBI, and many dazzling plays at short that were well ahead of their time. The final inductee from the 1953 class is Harry Wright, who has been called the father of professional baseball playing. Like his younger brother and fellow Hall of Famer George Wright, he was born and raised in England as a cricket player and became one of the founders of the first organized pro baseball team, the 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings. As time passed, he became more and more serious about trying to assemble the best baseball team he could, and he did so with him and George leading the way. The Red Stockings were so good that they eventually got kicked out of the National Association, so Harry and George went up to Boston to repeat the same process, and they were so dominant that future NL president William Holber moved his Chicago team out of this league and would go on to form the National League in the 1870s. Henry Chadwick would frequently refer to Harry as one of the most respected and most popular figures in the early days of baseball, and he credits Harry Wright as being the one guy who popularized it. For the final year I'm going to be going over in this video, there were 3 new inductees selected by the writers, and those chosen were a guy named Rabbit and 2 guys named Bill. Okay, obviously his name wasn't actually Rabbit, but I'll explain it in a second. Rabbit Maranville, whose real name was Walter, was a shortstop who had a pretty long career that was mostly spent with the Boston Braves. He received 82.9% of votes this year as the highest vote getter in 1954. As it was with someone like Joe Tinker, Rabbit was never the best offensive shortstop at any point in his career, but he more than made up for that with his amazing defense. He was famous for his basket catches at short and is the position's all-time leader in putouts, as well as a 3-time NL leader in defensive WAR. Despite never being known for his bat, Maranville came up big at the plate when needed, as he hit .308 in the 1914 World Series as part of the Miracle Braves team that went from last place to champions in a matter of months. He wrapped up his career in 1935 with 2,605 hits, 1,256 runs scored, and many amazing plays made at shortstop that made up for what he didn't have in his bat. When people think of all-time great Yankee catchers, they might think of Yogi Berra or Jorge Posada, and rightfully so. But the first great catcher in their reign of terror was Bill Dickey, who played with Ruth and Gehrig throughout his career. He got 80.2% support this year, and he was always a rock-solid backstop with the Bronx Bombers throughout his career. When he was brought to the Bronx in 1928, he was initially told to just be a complimentary hitter to Babe Ruth, and he did that very well and would grow so much as a hitter as time went on. As an 11-time AL All-Star, he hit .300 or better in 11 seasons, hit 20 or more homers 4 times, drove in 100 or more runs 4 times, and finished top 5 in MVP voting 3 times. Oh yeah, and I should also mention that he was the catcher of 7 World Series winning teams with the Yankees. Dickey would take a couple years off from 1944 to 45 to serve in the military, and he came back in 1946 for one last ride. He finished with a career .313 average, 1,209 RBI, and earned a reputation as one of the most respected figures in the game by his teammates and his peers, thanks to his greatness at the plate, behind the plate, and as a human being. The final inductee I'll be going over in this video is Bill Terry, a first baseman who spent his career as a New York Giants lifer. Bill got 77.4% of votes in 1954, and he was always business first when doing anything on a baseball diamond. He initially tried to make it to the bigs as a pitcher, and after never making it, he actually left pro baseball for a bit before being discovered by John McGraw in 1922. Once he became a full-time player, his impact was felt immediately, as he hit .300 in every full season he played, including a .401 average in 1930, and this was the last time a National League player ever hit .400. His career also included 6 seasons of 100 or more runs driven in, and being a major contributor to the Giants' World Series victory in 1933. He actually succeeded John McGraw as Giants manager in 1932, and would retire from playing in 1936. Terry finished with a .341 average, along with 2,193 hits and 1,078 RBI. Even though his Giants career almost never happened, he was able to turn it into one of the best careers of anybody who played in the majors during the 1920s and 30s.